Welcome to A Fine Time, The Nanny Revisited. This is a podcast about The Nanny, where we recap each episode and then discuss, sharing our own unique take on each episode. I'm Bernadette.
And I'm Debbie. Today we're talking about episode 4, The Nuchslep. While we normally start with a brief summary of the episode, today we want to note that we're adding a new shtick.
As we've seen in previous episodes, there are times that Debbie likes to point out things we will see in the future. So we've decided to create a future fun shtick that puts all of that together, and we'll put that towards the end of the episode. That way, if you're following along with us and you don't want any spoilers, you can skip it.
Thanks, Bernadette. Now I'm going to summarize the episode. Niles has a cold, so Fran, to everyone's surprise, volunteers to get dinner on the table. She orders both a New York and a Jewish favorite, takeout Chinese. After waiting an hour and a half, the food finally arrives, courtesy of the waiter who kissed Maggie at the backers party Maxwell threw in episode 1. Eddie asks Maggie out. Meanwhile, Maxwell gives Cece a dog, which Fran names Chester. After some hesitation, Maxwell agrees to let Maggie go on her date, but only if Fran serves as a chaperone. Before the date, Maggie is relieved that Fran is coming with her, but afterwards, she is resentful that Eddie liked Fran better. Eddie calls to speak to Fran, and Maggie is crushed. To patch things up with Maggie, Fran introduces her to the OGC, the official girlfriend's code. Fran is ready to dump Eddie when he comes to see her, but it turns out he just wanted to ask her to pass his resume and headshot on to Maxwell. Eddie didn't want to ask Maggie because he didn't want her to think that he was using her, and Fran is not shy. Maxwell lets Maggie go on a walk with Eddie because, as a pushy old broad told him, if he didn't let her walk out the door, she'd start sneaking out the window. Bernadette, do you have anything you want to add to this week's summary?
No, I think that's pretty concise.
Thank you. I got to tell you, it's getting harder and harder each week to keep our summary nice and concise because I just want to bring in all of the details. But of course,
well, that's what our discussions portion's for, I guess.
Very, very true. So there are a number of things to talk about in this episode. I usually start off, so I'm going to be polite and let you try this time.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to note one of the things in terms of Eddie showing up again that I thought was kind of funny and interesting is that I don't know if you caught this, Debbie, or not, but he said, I thought this house looked familiar.
Yes.
And I thought that was kind of funny just because the last time we saw Eddie was in episode 1 where we we noted in episode 1 had a different setting.
Very true.
And I kind of thought too, well, I'm pretty sure, and I could be remembering wrong, but I think when he left out of the front door in the first episode, which orientation wise is the same as where the back door is now. Does that seem right to you, Debbie?
I think you're right that he walked out the front door in episode 1. I got to tell you, that is a detail I did not pay very close attention to.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was funny that he's like, I thought this house looked familiar. And it's like, well, actually, it's a different set.
No, that's a very good point. But now you're making me wonder about the actual layout of the Sheffield home. Because in addition to where the front door has been repositioned, as you point out, there is that back door in the kitchen, which that stays. We see that multiple times in other episodes. So sorry, not planning to step on our future fun shtick, but that door does exist. There's also a door in the back of the kitchen. So like if you were walking in their kitchen past the refrigerator, if you walked straight down that like path, there's a door.
Oh,
there's
okay.
also the door in Maxwell's office. There's the back area, which again, sorry, you see that in other places, in other episodes. So there are a number of, I'm just trying to figure out how the mansion would work in a place like Manhattan.
And in this particular episode, I was thinking more of the layout as well, because later when Fran and Maxwell go up to try to comfort Maggie, like the orientation is that like the door's on the left of the screen and they're on the right. But when Fran goes into Maggie's room, like the orientation's the opposite. where
That's an excellent point.
it's on the left and she's going, and Maggie's bed is on the right. So I noticed that. And then this is the first episode I think I realized that there was a butler's pantry connecting the living room to the kitchen.
Um,
So
so
for some reason, the layout of the house is really something I've noticed in this particular episode.
so spoiler, this is the only episode where you ever see the butler's pantry between the kitchen and the dining room.
Interesting.
And that's actually the first note I had to talk about for today. Um, it appears for this episode and then it's gone because there are other times where they just walk back and forth.
Yeah,
Um,
because that's what I thought they did before.
correct. That is what they did before. This is it's sort of like Hogwarts, right?
Uh-huh.
Where you have rooms of requirement and moving
Butler
staircases
pantries of
and
requirement.
exactly. It was needed for this episode. Um, but I didn't pick up the Maggie's room being the wrong orientation. I did when we were in Maggie's room for that scene. I was looking at it and I was trying to figure out what because that's the first time we've seen her room,
Yeah.
and I was trying to figure out I'm sorry, I'm totally stepping all over our future fun shtick, but not in a way, not in a meaningful way. So please, guys, don't be offended. Um, we see Margaret's room another time in a later episode, and I could not for the life of me remember what it looks like. So I was trying to figure out if it changed as she got older, because I feel like the the pattern of her wall and the stuffed animals, it's very juvenile looking.
It is, and there's, like, a dollhouse in the back,
Yes.
of the room, and yeah, it did that was one of the notes I made is that it looks like it's a younger girl's room.
Right. And that's why I was trying to figure out what we see of her room in later episodes.
Mhm.
I'm actually going to write myself a note to come back to rooms in our future fun shtick. So I will not.
Yeah.
I'll keep my mouth shut now.
If anybody out there knows how to create, like, floor plans to try to figure out what the actual house would look like, um, because like I said, some of it, I'm just like, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Um, I gotta say, I've never thought about that before, but you raise a really good point. Um, so that's a great place to start. Um, I I want to talk a little bit more substantively. We have yet another episode where Gracie just has these wonderfully over like too grown up things to say.
Mhm.
When Fran's trying to get the Chinese order made,
Mhm.
um, she asks what Gracie wants, and she says, what do you feel like? And Gracie says, I feel trapped.
Yeah.
Um, but in this episode, I think there was a contradiction, and that's a very like grown up sentiment for her to express, which is what we've seen thus far into the series. But then in jumping ahead to the breakfast scene,
Mhm.
after Maggie makes calls herself, what does she call herself? I'm a worthless, pathetic, unlovable nothing.
Yeah.
And Gracie's response is, "Can I have your waffle?"
Mhm.
Like to me, that's it just felt like a total 180. Where in the first thing she's saying about feeling trapped, she's
Mhm.
a 40-year-old or older. She's a full on grown up. And then, can I have your waffle with no recognition, no commentary about
Yeah, you would almost expect her to make some type of kind of comment like that as well, maybe about herself.
yes, thank
Uh,
you.
and
I was
she
just
doesn't.
babbling, but you got to
She
the
wants
essence
those
of what I was
waffles.
saying. Sorry. I'm sorry. I should not talk over you. I
No,
apologize.
no, that was my fault.
You got the essence of what I was trying to say, that it just
Mhm.
seemed different
Yeah.
to me. Um, so let's a lot of my notes, unfortunately, I think will go into our future fun shtick. Um, so I'm trying to figure out what I can talk about that isn't.
Well,
Uh,
just quickly before we get more into the substance or different shticks, another thing I noticed that I guess I hadn't picked up on as much in previous episodes, um, is how, Maxwell refers to Maggie as Margaret and
mhm.
Gracie as Grace, like not the nicknames that everybody else calls them, which I mean, I think I noted before that he said Margaret, but like I don't know, for some reason it just stood out a little bit to me more um this episode.
Oh, that's interesting. I There was one point in the episode where I noted that he called her Margaret, but and
Mhm.
not Maggie. Um, but
I
I
think
think
it's
you're
because he said make sure Grace gets an optimistic fortune that I noticed he didn't say Gracie.
uh, right. Um, I guess I didn't pick up on that, but I think it probably is an intentional choice by the writers.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. I guess
Um,
I guess I'll see if anything changes. But as of right now, I kind of noted that still.
yeah. I I I, I want to say that changes, but I couldn't tell you since I clearly didn't note that he was calling them by their actual names instead of pet names.
Mhm.
Um, so let's I guess let's dive into waiting an hour and a half for Chinese food. That's crazy. Um, I don't know if you caught the line by Fran where she said, "It's been an hour and a half. I should be hungry again," or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I should be hungry again already.
Exactly. Um,
Mhm.
an hour and a half to me seems like a really long time to wait for any type of food.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and then Eddie showing up as the delivery guy, that was great. Did you catch
Mhm.
the line when Fran hands Maggie the money and says, "You pay him, give him a good tip, but not too big. We don't want him to think we're desperate."
Uh-huh. Yeah, I
I thought
did.
that was great.
Mhm.
Um, Go ahead.
And then well, just in terms of Eddie, later Fran's like, "What are you? A delivery Don Juan?" And
Yes.
then Maxwell, I think also had a name for him, and it's Eddie, the kissing waiter.
Yes. That's exactly what I was thinking. The kissing waiter. Which on that note, when Maxwell said, and actually just because you mentioned the names, I find myself I'm constantly referring to Mr. Sheffield as Maxwell,
Mhm.
but you know, other people would call him Max probably because it's less formal, but I for some reason I've constantly been calling him Maxwell as we've been doing the show. So I don't know.
Mhm. I think I've just been following your lead with that too. I
Well,
don't think I thought about it much.
well, he does sometimes go by Max.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, I totally lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Um, oh, that's where I was going to say when Fran is telling Max or Maxwell about you know Maggie's been asked out on this date, and he says, "Well, do I even do I know this boy?" And
Mhm.
Fran's like, "Well, can we ever really know anybody?" I thought
Yeah.
that was great. That's just like in the episode "The Smoke Gets in Your Lies," where she tries to go and tell Maxwell about smoking, Brighton smoking, and she just like totally is, you know, fast pedaling or backpedaling or sort of putting her foot in her mouth, trying to not give the information in a forthright fashion.
Mhm.
Um, so
Yeah.
we'll see more of that, obviously.
Mhm.
Um, so what do you think of Maxwell's solution of sending Fran on the date as a chaperone?
It transported me back to all those romance novels and period dramas. Um, so that's why I thought it was interesting as well. Just, and I don't know if you're planning on talking about this a little bit more in one of our shticks, but just how she's seen, like she again says, "Oh no, I'm like essentially the third wheel," and like the elderly couple at the movie theaters, like
Yes.
you don't have to be old, you just have to be a loser to be in Fran's position, which was harsh.
Yeah, I had that as one of the things I wanted to comment on.
Mhm. But you know what I guess I hadn't as I was thinking about it more, Maggie's supposed to be 14, right?
Right.
Do we know how old Eddie is? Because I know Fran noted he's saving up for Yale, but I didn't know how imminent that was. Like whether do you get what I mean? Like I don't know if he's like 17 and about to like
Right.
go into senior year. or if he's supposed to be younger. Like, I'm not quite sure.
That's a great point. I don't know how old Eddie is either. I don't think we will ever learn that. Um, but
Hmm.
I did think that the reason she mentioned that he wanted to go to Yale because that's supposed to be a marker that he's reputable or it's
Hmm.
okay for him to take Maggie out.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
but
because I was just because that's the other thing too, though, is just I don't know, like to some extent, with Maggie being 14, I think to some extent, and younger people would probably hate me for saying this, it's probably a little bit reasonable to, at least on the first one when you don't really know who the other guy is, to have someone nearby.
well, that's a great point, and I guess I didn't think it through. I mean, so there is also a dynamic in New York City that a lot of teenagers don't get driver's licenses or permits or cars because
Hmm.
it's sort of a headache and or a nightmare to have a car in the city. Um, but as you were talking, I realized like practically speaking, like how would they get to the movies? I guess they went on the subway, but I don't think the subway would, you know, be super for a 14-year-old anyway.
Hmm.
Um, you know, especially at night and anyway. So yeah, he must be older. I guess it just never occurred to me. So it does make sense for there to be a chaperone.
Hmm.
Um,
And I know, and again, like I'm saying, probably if teenagers ever listen to this, they might hardly like they might disagree very hard with me. But now that I'm older,
correct. I mean, I
it's
remember being a
like, hmm.
teenager. I remember being a teenager and reading, for example, Harry Potter, and
Mhm.
thinking, that it totally made sense for a teenager to be saving the world, right? And
Yeah.
to be making all these decisions and doing all these things. And now that I'm a older, more mature adult, I realize that that was naive, young thinking, which thankfully I have escaped from. I guess I don't know.
Hmm. Well, because the other thing is that, in particular, like Maggie is portrayed as being kind of younger, in she's not necessarily very mature.
Correct.
Um, as we discussed earlier, her bedroom is also reflective of a kind of a younger, because although she is quiet, um, and stuff, like, I don't think that necessarily translates to maturity because as we see, she just blows up. She blew up in the first episode when, Maxwell had a problem with her kissing Eddie. And then in this episode, when Eddie called, and wanted to speak to Fran, you know, she just like let it loose. And it's like,
Right.
you. And I mean, she even was making snippy comments like, why don't you take it like you take everything else? And then I trusted you and you stole my boyfriend. I hate you, and storming off. Like,
Right.
so she's not, again, despite her more calm and quiet and generally sweet demeanor, she's not necessarily mature.
Correct. I mean, I'll also mention Brighton makes that snarky comment, sarcasm from Maggie.
Uh-huh.
But and more to your point about her blowing up, after she's left the breakfast table, Fran and Max will go upstairs, and she shouts something at them like, "Why can't you let me die in peace?" And
Uh-huh.
clearly threw something because you hear it hit the door
Mhm.
or the wall, hit something.
Yeah.
Um, so you're right; she's not very mature. Um, not to get too far into the fashion, her her wardrobe is also at times very juvenile,
Yes. Yeah.
um, and sort of vague.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so before we go too far, I want to circle back to the conversation Fran and Maxwell have, and
Mhm.
she gives him what I thought was really interesting advice. Um, Boys will come knocking, and if you don't let them in the front door, she's going to start sneaking out the window.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably good advice. Um, you know, at some point you have to trust your kids to make good decisions because that gives them the as Fran will say in something along these lines in a later episode, you have to trust her to give her the confidence and the self-assurance to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
And also, again, by like it gave them an opportunity to again kind of establish a parameter for them, right? Like, okay, you can go if you have Fran there as your chaperone,
right,
or like getting to know the guy more, than other, because if they're totally dismissive of the entire thing, then if Maggie starts, sneaking out the window to meet him, that could be a much more dangerous kind of situation. Because again, I'm not saying Eddie himself is going to do anything like that, but you never know. So I think to some extent, yeah, it's ignoring something's not going to help.
correct. I mean, you're right. It's not Eddie going to do something. It's going to be teenagers possibly making poor choices,
Hmm.
and whatever those choices may be. You're right. That's probably going to be a more dangerous situation than, okay, yes, you can go to a movie, but the Nuchslep is going to go with you.
Hmm. And I thought it was interesting too. Again, I think you noted before that Maggie was actually kind of relieved that Fran was going with her, because she was nervous about it being her first date. Because I think another alternative could have been, Fran goes along, but she sits somewhere else in the movie theater. Like she doesn't have to necessarily be right there. I don't know.
Right, which is what Maxwell says at one point. Like, as a prop, you should have sat in the back like a proper chaperone.
Yeah. And so to some like I kind of wonder if there was another conversation that we did not see on air where maybe Maggie, wanted Fran to be a little bit closer,
Right,
or if Fran saw, okay, she's having a hard time talking. I'm just going to be there to help get the conversation going. Um, so, so and we saw Maggie was struggling.
yes, that's putting it nicely.
Yeah, when they're in the movie theater, while you know Eddie's getting them refreshments, she's asking Fran how it's going, and she's like, "Oh, well, when you said hello to him, elaborate on that."
Right, I thought that was great advice on Fran's part. Like,
Hmm.
elaborate. What did she say? Be yourself, but be yourself, only louder.
Uh-huh. But
And,
poor Maggie takes that a little too literally.
right. I mean, I took the note that Fran gives the advice, be yourself, only louder, and then Maggie is noticeably louder, but not more articulate.
Hello.
Exactly. I
Sorry for
love
the dog.
popcorn. Um, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and then poor Maggie, Fran's making all these jokes and stuff, and uh for anybody who hasn't seen the episode lately, when Eddie comes back, he has a big thing of popcorn and then these huge cups, like drinks. I mean, they're huge. And Maggie's attempting to make a joke about it, and all she can really get is, my soda's so big, I don't know if I can finish it. It's really big.
right.
and
And
then
that was
and then the movie
after.
starts and Fran goes, "There is a God."
Right. But the part of that I think would be helpful for our listeners who haven't seen the episode recently is that when Eddie comes back with the giant sodas, and for context, they look as big, if not bigger, than the bag of popcorn for the three of them to share. Right.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
he makes a joke about how it's so big it should come with an undertow, and Fran makes a joke about how it needs a lifeguard or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then poor Maggie is just, as you put it, stuck.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I love the line from Fran, "Oh, there is a God," or whatever she says,
Mhm.
because Maggie needed all the saving she could get.
Yeah.
Um, and as we get more details of the date at breakfast the next morning, everything, all of the jokes, all of the good humor from the date came from Fran.
Mhm.
Um,
You,
it,
you, you.
I think you're missing like three more U's, but yes,
Yeah.
because it is very emphatic.
It
Um,
is.
and then, you know, so um, at the breakfast scene, you know,
Mhm.
Fran says, "Oh, I'm sure that's Eddie calling right now," and it was Eddie. And
Mhm.
Niles announces it's Master Eddie on the phone, but not for Miss Margaret. It's for you. And Fran says something like me, and so then Niles copies. I thought it was great that he copies Maggie and says you.
Yep.
There's six. I think I counted right. There's six of them. There are either five or six of them, and maybe I just did seven, but same idea.
Yeah.
Um, so it's just great. And then you can hear her Fran's discomfort on the phone.
Mhm.
Um, and so in that scene, there's also the comment from Brighton comparing Maggie to mashed potatoes. So before Eddie calls, Maggie says something that she just sat there like a lump, like
Uh-huh.
silent like a lump. And
Mhm.
Brighton's like, so do mashed potatoes, and everybody loves them.
Mhm.
Like, it sounds
Yeah.
sarcastic, but do you think that he was actually trying to be supportive?
I I it could cut either way because that's actually a nice kind of comment. Like, people
Exactly.
love mashed potatoes. So even if you were a lump, it's fine. But it's also Brighton, so I can't be 100% sure.
Right, but it makes me wonder if, what Fran said to him in episode 1 about,
Mhm.
be nicer to your sister because one day your dad's going to be old and sick, you're going to want him to live with her. If that,
Mhm.
because that's part of why Brighton was so attentive to her in episode 1.
Mhm.
Um I kind of wonder if that's carrying over in the psyche of little Brighton Sheffield.
Maybe. I guess we'll see.
On the note of breakfast, I just need to point out that the Sheffields have amazing breakfasts.
Uh-huh.
Like, I don't know how closely you're looking at the spread of food they have, but this time, because Niles is feeling better, he makes um what he says is Maxwell's favorite Belgian waffles, and Max was like, I don't remember those being my favorite. He's like, oh, I guess they're mine.
Yeah.
Um,
And then Fran comes in and she's like, "Ooh, Eggos."
right. And he's like, no, Belgian waffles. Ah, close. Or something like that is her response.
Mhm.
I will say the one question I have for them about their breakfast, like in previous episodes where they've had breakfast, it's been eggs and it's been like a savory breakfast with orange
Mhm.
juice, so that makes sense to me. But why would you want to have orange juice with Belgian waffles?
I mean, some people just like orange juice, I guess.
I mean, I love orange juice as much as the next person, but I
Mhm.
would not want to have sweet Belgian waffles with the syrup that Maggie was getting her hair in with
Mhm.
orange juice because the sweetnesses would not go well together.
Mhm.
But that's just me.
Guess it comes just down to personal preference.
I guess so. Um,
I
so
do want to note
go
it's
ahead.
not quite uh, uh, a little bit into the fashion, but not really. Fran has another robe at
I noted
breakfast.
that also.
We can discuss that more in our other shtick, but I
Yes,
did make a note. She
excellent.
obviously has a collection of robes.
Yes, yes, she does. Um, so after Maggie leaves the breakfast table, very upset, um, Fran and Maxwell have this conversation about how Fran's relationship with the kids, and specifically Maggie, and I guess Maggie's friends, is different than the previous nanny's relationships.
Mhm.
And Maxwell makes this comment that with Maggie, it's more like your girlfriends or something like
Mhm.
that, which
Mhm.
gives Fran the idea of the official girlfriend's code. So she gets herself into Maggie's room, um, query why Maggie had not locked the door. Um,
Maybe she's not used to storming off to her room. I don't know.
I don't know, but if I had been a teenager and that upset, I definitely would have locked the door.
Mhm.
So, Fran walks into the room and she offers a Malamar, and Maggie's response is, "I'm too depressed to eat," or something like that. And Fran says, "Gee, I wish depression had that effect on me."
Mhm.
And I just think that that's great, um, because as we've talked about in previous episodes, you know, leaning on food is something we're going to see a lot of.
Yeah.
So, and then
And
getting in,
actually, rule number 3, Debbie, is when it comes to chocolates, every girl is for herself.
it's every girl for herself, correct? Yeah. So in the official girlfriend's code, um, the other rules we heard about. are rule number 1, you never gossip about your best friend, and which Fran describes as a totally moronic rule that nobody follows.
Yeah.
Rule number 2, if a girl falls for a guy and the idiot guy falls for her effervescent but totally blameless friend, then the aforementioned friend is obliged to dump him.
Hmm.
I feel like that was developed very situationally.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, but also, I mean, I think that is common though in friend groups when you're younger, like middle school, high school, where someone might have a crush on someone, but that person likes the friend.
right.
Like that's happened a ton, at least with my friends. But I, I actually, with one of my best friends, we turned out we both liked the same guy, but we like promised to each other it would not affect our friendship.
Okay. And did it?
No, it didn't affect our friendship. We're still really good friends.
Okay, cool. So you guys subscribe to the official girlfriend's code.
Yeah, except a slightly different version, I would say, from the one that Fran says.
Fair.
Yeah.
The only other rule I think we heard is rule number 27.
Mhm.
Just because you're dumping someone doesn't mean you shouldn't look your best.
Mhm. But here's the thing, Debbie, that I think is interesting
Yeah.
is that dumping implies that you're together to begin with, doesn't it?
Yes.
But they're not together, and obviously later we learn it's all misunderstanding. But again, I think part of doing the podcast and thinking about it, I'm probably reading a bit more into things or like thinking about it more more deeply. But the other thing that kind of was a little icky to me was the idea of this large age gap kind of relationship and referring it to it as dumping and all that kind of stuff. Um, I don't know if it's an occupational hazard, but
Well, interesting. Because when Fran and Eddie are talking, he says something, Miss Fine, you're old enough to be mine. She cuts him off, watch it, or something like that.
yeah.
My sister.
Hmm.
Um, you're right. There is a probably a significant age gap. To say nothing of the fact that he's probably still a minor. Um, so
Hmm.
there's probably a 10+ year age gap between them.
Oh, no, probably more than that.
I'm being
We
generous.
I know. But if we're even subscribing with Fran being 29,
Yep.
and he's a minor, it's definitely over the 10-year mark.
It's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of like one of those things where I was like, oh, this seems it's weird that they're kind of well, that it's assumed that she's, like it's Maggie describes it as you stole my boyfriend. And
Right.
Fran's like, "Oh, I need to dump him." And it just again, it could be a 2021 lens as well.
Interesting point. Can I ask in I can't remember if it was the last episode or the episode before where Gracie is asked about her crush or something
Uh-huh.
and she says something about Ted Koppel
Uh-huh.
and Barney. Do you
Yep.
have the same kind of reaction to Gracie having a crush on Ted Koppel?
Well, again, I don't know if I actually know who Ted Koppel is, but assuming, obviously an adult, I don't have the same sense because I think it's common for, younger people to have crushes, but
Hmm.
it's different to actually entertaining the idea of dating like in real life. 'Cause I'm
Okay,
sure you probably had celebrity crushes when you were younger, right?
absolutely.
I think that's pretty common. But in this specific scenario, there's like this entertaining of the thought of actually dating or something. And I
Okay,
think that's where it's different.
okay,
Does
so
that make sense?
it's the treatment of it. It's one thing for it to be one-sided for Gracie having a crush on a significantly older, according to Wikipedia, journalist, British-born American broadcast journalist.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and so that's fine because it's one-sided. Nothing clearly is going to happen there.
Hmm.
Versus the fact that Fran and Maggie and others are treating the possibility of Fran dating this much younger guy as a realistic possibility.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
And
distinction
again,
you're drawing. Okay.
we don't know his exact age, but presumably he's a minor. If he's not a minor, then it's also very problematic that he's dating Maggie, a 14-year-old. So
Fair.
kind of like, sorry, I'm getting caught up in this, but
No, it's fine. But
again,
as
I
you're,
think it might be a 2021 lens as well.
I think you're probably right. Although as you're talking, I'm realizing he's the delivery guy, which means he probably has a car. So he has to be older then, because you can't. I mean, when I got my permit late, but I think you could get your permit when we were kids at 16. So in New York,
Mm-hmm.
um, they might have dropped that since then. But if he had a car and was acting as a delivery boy, he had to be older. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, circling back to what we said before.
Yeah.
Um, I have just a few things I'd like to circle back on. But if there's more you want to talk about towards the end of the episode, we can talk about that, and then I'll go back. However
Okay.
you want to do it.
You can go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say, you mentioned the middle-aged Jewish couple they interact with in the movie theater. I just want to again reiterate that I think they were fantastic. I thought
That's
they were
interesting you
hilarious.
said middle-aged because I read them as elderly.
Oh, you're probably right. They're definitely closer to senior citizen. So you're right. They're definitely not middle aged. I'm sorry,
Oh,
my
it's okay.
definition was wrong. But I just thought they were fantastic and hilarious. Um, so I also wanted to comment on with the chaperone thing. Fran has this one line where she says, "Chaperone, is that even still a word anymore?" But I think you're probably right, considering the fact that Maggie is 14. That was probably the right call. And then the last thing I'll say before we jump into some of our shticks, um, I don't know if you caught this line, but Maxwell says, "My daughter wants to date an actor. Where did
Mm-hmm.
I go wrong?"
Maybe you shouldn't be in theater, Maxwell.
That was my reaction too, because how is that any worse than her dating a dancer, a musician, well, I don't think there'd be any teenage Broadway producers, but you know what I mean? Like, how is that any worse than dating anyone else in the business?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, so yeah. Do you want to, since we've kind of touched a little bit on it, do we want to jump into our favorite and not so favorite fashion?
Sure, let's go for it.
So you've already mentioned we see yet another new bathrobe.
Mm-hmm.
I like this one. It had flowers on the neckline or
Uh-huh.
whatever. I
Yeah,
like
they
that a
kind of look
lot.
like daisies or
Yeah.
something like that. Mm-hmm.
I mean, as you put it, she has a great collection of bathrobes. Um,
Mm-hmm.
my favorite outfit is again the Twiggy vest with the white bell sleeved shirt.
Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the episode.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. What I noticed in terms of this episode as well, you kind of mentioned it before, but Maggie on her date and even after that, her her fashion is very reads very young.
Right.
Um, but I noticed at the end when Eddie comes back and Fran's gonna quote unquote dump him, what Maggie's wearing is kind of similar to Fran's in terms of she had a billowy white shirt with the sleeves. She did have some ruffles,
Yep.
but I think she had a vest. I could be wrong
It,
there.
it was an over something, but yeah.
Yeah, but it read not as young as she had dressed earlier in the episode. And again, it kind of with the sleeves, it reminded me of what Fran had worn.
Yes.
So I don't
It
know. I kind of
also
made note of that.
So I also noted that dress. I gotta say I didn't really note for any positive reasons what else Maggie wore in the episode. What she's wearing in her bedroom after she storms off is this like patterned dress,
Hmm.
which I'm not sure if I would that could either be read as very young or very old. I'm not sure which way
Yeah,
that
well,
goes.
it read very 90s to me.
Okay, fair.
'Cause I remember that pattern. It's a very dense pattern, I would say.
Okay.
Kind of dark.
It was dark. I mean, I
Mhm.
couldn't tell you I
But she
remember that
had
pattern.
the black choker, and chokers
Yes,
were big back then.
very true. But I noted the other outfit that you were talking about in the butler's pantry, when she's gonna go for the walk with Eddie, and I kind of noted that it had more like there we had an outfit of hers that had more personality. And I think you're right that she was copying Fran to some extent, but it also was sort of channeling Cece, I
With
thought,
the ruffle portion.
with the bib part, because that's what Cece had on the last episode. And then
Mhm.
also the length of the skirt.
Mhm.
Because I looked at it a couple times, but it looked to me like she was wearing a very long green skirt. It was a dark green. Um, and it reminded me a little bit of what Cece was wearing. We'll talk about Cece and Maxwell and Chester in a bit, but what she was wearing when she met Chester, she was wearing a navy blue long skirt with a longer jacket,
Mhm.
and so that Maggie's outfit reminded me of that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and in general, I'm not really one, like in my day-to-day life who notes fashionable stuff. Like I'm not very attentive to what people are wearing. So even in this, like even when I'm looking out for it, like I didn't really pay much attention to Maggie's like skirt, I guess, because I just noted the top
Hmm.
looked kind of familiar to me.
Right.
Um, but yeah, but I would agree like that the top Fran has is very pretty. It reminds me of like a pirate.
Yeah. Fair.
um, I would definitely like accidentally dip my sleeve into sauce at like lunch.
Yeah. Probably. That's what happens
But
when you
it's
wear
pretty.
white, especially.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but I also feel like again there weren't as many costume changes or not as dramatic. Um, I wasn't a huge fan of what Fran wore to the movie theaters. I couldn't tell if it was cutout squares on her black sweater on the sleeves or if it was just a lighter color.
I thought it was just a lighter color. I was going to
Yeah,
say
I couldn't
cutouts
quite
weren't
tell.
big, but I don't think that's true because later things have cutouts.
Mhm.
Um, can we talk about fashion we really didn't like?
Go for it.
I really hated Cece's last outfit with
Oh,
the
well,
fox collar.
yeah,
Um,
well, you're an animal lover, Debbie.
exactly. That's exactly why I hated it. Um,
Well, and the joke and the implication was they're like, "Oh, I hope Chester's doing well," and she comes in and it kind of looks like Chester.
yup.
And so everybody has that moment of, "Oh no, what happened to Chester?" And then Chester comes trotting in
Right.
towards Fran. But
So if that's okay, I think this is a. Oh, we're not close enough to the end, so I will not use this as a transition into our future fun. Um, but I will talk more about Chester when we get there. Do you want to talk about our 90s nostalgia?
mhm. Yeah. So as I kind of noted, the fashion, especially Maggie's, was definitely kind of 90s. The other thing is that at the beginning, when Niles is sneezing and Fran's asking, after him, and he's like, "I'm feeling a bit queer," and she says, "Don't ask, don't tell." Uh,
Yes, I have this too.
mm-hmm. And then I think she followed that up with something like, "Oh, come out of the closet," or something like that. I'm not
Yep.
exactly sure I don't remember the line. Um, but yeah, so definitely um, interpreting queer in that way. And obviously, since the 90s, there's been a lot of change in terms of LGBTQ plus and all of that. But
Yes.
but again, it's like she seems supportive of them, but it's also kind of just such a flippant comment. So I'm not quite sure how you took it, Debbie.
I
Um,
just took it as, it felt outdated.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, Particularly the reference to don't ask, don't tell, which would have been relatively new then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, since that, if I recall correctly, was implemented by President Bill Clinton.
That's who I think did that as well, but I can't say with 100% certainty.
I'm fairly certain, but I didn't fact check before we started talking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, that was the first thing that caught my attention. The second thing is something that caught your attention in previous episodes, which is the cordless home phones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if this were happening today, someone Fran would have whipped out her cell phone and placed an order on Grubhub or Seamless or
Mm-hmm.
Uber Eats or whatever. She wouldn't have had to call anybody. It would have been tapping on her phone and it would be there probably not an hour and a half later. So,
Well, and we wouldn't have the whole breakfast scene with Eddie calling. Eddie probably would have texted Fran.
yes, excellent point. Or he would have texted Maggie to say, "Can I talk to Fran?" Or "Can I get Fran's number?" or something, which would have been even
Or
worse.
instead of even having a number, just like messaging on Facebook or other social media.
Excellent. Yeah, no, exactly. Um, was there anything else that struck your 90s nostalgia?
I'm trying to think. I not not particularly, not that's, coming to mind right now. Was there anything for you?
The only other thing I wanted to note, and I will probably note this every time we see them, are the really old 1990s or 80s cars
Oh
that we
yeah,
see
at
in the
the very
transition
beginning.
scenes. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, so did you catch any notable New Yorkers?
So, in terms of New York, I mean, I was I'm not as good as you, Debbie. I didn't look it up to see, but they mentioned at one point a Teresa Paleli or something as a costume director, and I wasn't sure if that was an actual person
So
or if
I
just within the world.
I googled because I didn't know and I couldn't find anything, so I believe that is a fictional person. If Teresa Palelli does exist and we are mistaken, please let us know, and we will make a correction in a future episode. Thank you.
Yes. But I feel like there weren't quite as many references to people. Now, obviously, as I noted in the first episode, Eddie is played by James Marsden, which is now a well-known actor, although I know Debbie, you weren't as familiar with him. Um,
Sorry, Mr. Marsden. I apologize again.
because he's listening.
Exactly.
But I feel like there did did you pick up on many?
George the Sixth.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah,
Um,
historical figures.
yeah, and then Don Juan,
Yep,
which
delivery Don Juan.
you've already mentioned. The only
Mhm.
other notable New Yorker is not actually a New Yorker, but Rumpelmeyer's, what was apparently a tea and pastry cafe originally in the Hotel Saint Moritz. At least that's according to restaurantingthroughhistory.com.
Mhm.
Um, I was a little unclear as to when and at what point it stopped being in service, but so that apparently was a New York institution. It My understanding is it no longer exists.
Oh, okay.
Um, I don't know if it existed at the time that the show was current,
Mhm.
um, but so that was the only other notable New Yorker that
Mhm.
I caught. That one at least is a New Yorker, even if not a living New Yorker.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Okay.
so transitioning into our Yiddishkeit shtick,
Yeah.
the first thing before we jump into anything
Mhm.
more substantive, obviously Nuchslep, the title of the episode, which
Mhm.
it was defined on the show itself, is Yiddish. So I'll just mention that.
Mhm. And do you think that's an accurate definition of what Fran gave in terms of just like the person, the tag along?
Yeah, so I did some googling just to make sure, and yeah, what I found was a tag along, a pathetic loser living on the cusp of other people's lives. Is that I think that's actually how the show describes it. But then on Google, it was like a tag along, a third wheel, someone coming along on a date, things like that.
Okay.
So it tracked.
Yeah. And Debbie, Fran mentioned that if they got Chinese takeout, they would learn, quote, how Jewish people eat. Is that a stereotype or could you elaborate on that?
I would love to. So there's actually been a lot written about the history of Jews and Chinese food. It is a stereotype for a reason. I like to tell people that Chinese food is the food of my people. Um, so, according to an NPR interview, Jews started eating in Chinese restaurants at sorry, I should let me rephrase that. Um, Jews eating in Chinese restaurants dates back to at least 1899 when the American Jewish Journal criticized Jews for eating at non kosher restaurants. Um, So as a Jewish New Yorker, I grew up eating Chinese food and not just on Christmas. There are a number of reasons why Jews and Chinese food go together. Um, Obviously, there is the stereotype of Jews eating Chinese food on Christmas. As the Museum of Food and Drink noted, Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan said to then Senator Graham that when he asked her where she was on Christmas, she said, you know, like all Jews, I was probably at a Chinese restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
So the history of Jews and Chinese food on Christmas comes from the fact that not only did Jewish and Chinese immigrants tend to live near each other in places like New York City, but
Mm-hmm.
both groups were left out from celebrating Christmas since they're non-Christian. And so Chinese places happened to be open on Christmas and Christmas Eve, so Jews would go there because that was where you could go to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the question is, well, it's not kosher, so how did that start happening? And so one thing is that there is no mixing of meat and dairy because Chinese food typically does not have any milk. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the major rules of kashrut, or as we've mentioned before, the laws of you know food or what is fit for consumption, does not allow the mixing of meat and dairy. So that's one thing that they didn't have to worry about by going to a Chinese restaurant. And then there's also, I've heard this elsewhere, that food, particularly if it's meat, tends to be cut very small in Chinese food. And so if there was some form of trafe or trafe, which would be categorically non-kosher food, if it was included, it would be such a small piece you wouldn't know. And so it would not be a violation. I
Hmm.
mean, it's a technical
Interesting.
violation, but if it's less than, I think, half the size of an olive or something like that, it's not a big deal.
Huh. Interesting. I mean, but because I also noted though that when Fran is like ordering Chinese, she again says she feels like shrimp, which last episode you mentioned to me that is not kosher, right?
Correct. It is not kosher because shrimp is not uh, a sea creature that has fins and scales. So
Mhm.
not kosher. I don't know if you picked up on this, but when Eddie came, he brought with him some spare ribs, and she says something about, "Oh, you're bringing me pork." Pork is also not kosher.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that a lot of people tend, if to the extent that they know anything about kashrut, if they are not Jewish, they know that Jews don't eat pork, they don't eat pig.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that for land animals, they have to have split hooves and chew their cud. So things like cows. Um, as a vegetarian, I get to avoid all of this, which is wonderful. Um, but yeah,
Makes
so
it easier, right?
it does make things much easier. So I did note that, and it as we're doing this as I'm doing this rewatch to do the podcast with you, I am noting more when there are things like that where there are violations of kashrut or obvious violations of kashrut that I guess I haven't really noticed before. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. Was
there
there
wasn't
anything else in this shtick?
no, there wasn't a lot of Yiddish in this episode, other than
Mm-hmm.
the word Nuchslep getting bandied about a bunch.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I guess that leaves our future fun and our episode rating. So I've been dying to talk about Chester the dog.
Mm-hmm.
So can we talk about him in our future fun episode, future fun shtick, please?
Yes, go ahead, Debbie.
Excellent. So this is the first episode where we meet Chester. Chester is wonderful. What do you think of him, Bernadette?
Well, for anybody who hasn't seen the episode, Maxwell gave Chester to Cece as a birthday present, or was it a birthday present
It
or just a
was.
present? Okay. Well, and of course, the whole setup to that scene is that, Maxwell takes Cece into his office. Cece sits down. Maxwell gets down on his knee and I didn't write down exactly what he said, but along the lines of, you know, she deserves to have someone to come home to, not to be alone. So of course, setting it up as if he's going to propose. And instead, he tells Cece to close her eyes. And then is it Niles or someone else brings in the
So
dog?
yes,
Maxwell slips the leash over Cece's um,
wrist.
wrist because, of course, she has her left hand out. And she's like, "Is this an engagement dog?" And he's like, what? And she's like, what an engaging dog.
Yep. I have that highlighted as something I wanted to talk about as well.
Mm-hmm. But the dog kind of snarls at Cece. But of course, when Fran comes in, the dog loves her.
Yep. As Maxwell points out in a later scene, even the dog preferred you to Cece.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you think of Chester? I am glad you picked up on the running shtick, the running joke of Chester not liking Cece but loving Fran.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, I think is it Niles who notes Chester's fluffy and a good judge of character.
yes. Um, I don't know if you caught this in the credits,
Mm-hmm.
but did you see who plays Chester?
I did not.
So I love that the credits actually listed him as Chester Drescher.
Oh.
So he was Fran's. I don't remember where I learned this, but
Mm-hmm.
he was Fran Drescher's dog in real life, and so
Oh,
it's
okay.
a running gag that he's excited to see her, which makes
Uh-huh.
sense because she's at the time. I mean, unfortunately now Chester is probably long gone.
Mm-hmm.
May he rest in peace. But Fran was his person, so of course he was excited to see her,
Mm-hmm.
and so
Well,
they
oh,
oh,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh, okay, we're both too polite.
Yeah,
Um,
go.
so I just remember hearing or reading at some point that they had these tricks for getting Chester to growl at Cece. Like she would move him quickly or something. And so they really played that up.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just mention in a later series that Fran Drescher is in, she has another Pomeranian, and I didn't check the credits, but I would assume that that was also her dog.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, I was wondering why in the last, like the ending credits, like she's just flossing his teeth and they have like matching blue outfits.
yep.
Uh,
So we will see more of Chester.
uh,
That
I will note though, Debbie,
yeah,
because obviously you're a huge animal lover. I don't mind animals, but I'm not really a pet person. So I would just note in general, it's not a good idea to give people pets if they have not explicitly stated that they want one.
I agree with that entirely.
Hmm.
Um,
Because even Cece's like, I'm going to take him home and put him down.
put
And
him to sleep.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we'll actually see Chester a lot. And not only will we see these interactions, the interaction between how he he interacts with Fran versus how he interacts with Cece, but we'll also see Fran doing a lot of caretaking for him and spending more time with him, while on the other hand, Cece will forget him in a cab or almost forget him in a cab, you
Hmm.
know, or she'll forget to unpack him from a bag at some point. Like she is not a she is also not a pet person.
Hmm.
I would go
Well, in
far enough to
general,
say
too, though, she's not very nurturing. Like she's
correct,
kind of has the same attitude to the kids at this point. So
correct.
yeah.
Yeah, she is not warm and fuzzy,
Hmm.
and so she is the perfect person to not give a pet to. And I don't know if
Hmm.
you caught Fran making the comment you should have gotten her the toaster oven.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, she probably would have had an easier time taking care of the toaster oven.
Yeah. Yep.
Uh,
Yeah.
so go ahead.
One more thing just before we go into the episode ratings. This is not necessarily in any category of shticks, but I did note that when Fran's explaining to Maggie that she can go on the date and she's like, "Yay," and she's like, "Hold on, you didn't see the fine print yet." I had to
Yes,
laugh.
yes.
I love puns. I know some people don't, but I love a good pun.
I have just a couple more things in our future fun that I just want to highlight.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go
That
ahead.
it's fine. So for our wonderful listeners out there, Bernadette and I take our notes separately, and we do not share them before we get together. So that way, our discussion is more engaging and lively, and not at all rehearsed. Which is why sometimes we might not know when the other has more to say or not more to say. So that's
Mhm.
why we have this little disconnect. Anyway, I noted in the scene where Maxwell and Fran are talking about Maggie going on the date that he says something like that you've set up this dynamic where you're the good you're the good one. You've allowed her to go, and I'm this ogre. I never realized how often the word ogre comes up in this series. There's a later episode where Maxwell is concerned about Maggie spending too much time with her boyfriend, where he wants to ship her off to the French Alps. And then in that episode, both Fran and Maggie call him an ogre. Like,
Hmm.
to me, it's just a word that sticks out because I don't talk about ogres in everyday. I don't call people ogres in the
Yeah, and
neighborhood.
like my mind immediately went to Shrek.
Right. Um, so two other things I'll mention. We do see the inside of Brighton's room, and we do see the inside of Maxwell's room and Niall's room in later episodes. We do see Maggie's room again, but I can't recall what it looks like. I think we also see Gracie's room, and we definitely see Fran's room. So we get to see all of the bedrooms in future episodes. So we have that to look forward to. And then, as we were talking about Maggie failing to lock the door, I realized that there is another episode where a major plot point turns on the fact that Maggie forgot to lock a door. So
Oh, hmm.
we will talk more about that in a few years when we get there. So
Sounds good.
I think that I think those are all the points I wanted to raise. Is it your turn or my turn to rank the episode first?
I think
I,
it's my turn.
I think that's right. It's your turn. Go ahead, Bernadette.
Um, I think again, just because doing this for the podcast, it has me thinking deeper than if I were to just like turn this on for fun. And I got so caught up in the age thing. I'm rating it a 3.
Okay, fair.
So yeah. How about you, Debbie?
I'm giving it a 4. I really enjoyed rewatching it. It was more clever than I remembered it being. But I know that next week's episode, I'm very excited to talk about, and I didn't have the same level of excitement going into this one, so
Mhm.
I feel like there is room for improvement. Hence the 4.
Okay,
Um,
that's
so
fair.
all right, well, that's all we have for you today. We hope you had a fine time with us as we revisited The Nanny. Join us next week when we'll be discussing episode 5, Here Comes the Brood.
If you would like to reach us on social media, you can find us on Twitter at Nanny Revisited. You can also send us email at a fine time nanny revisited at gmail.com. Have a great week.